Okay, so how many times have you heard the phrase, just be yourself?
Oh, countless, right? I mean, it's everywhere. Like almost a cliche at this point.
Totally.
Yeah.
But it's one of those things that sounds super simple on the surface, like just a throwaway line.
Yeah, totally.
But when you actually try to unpack it, like, what does that actually mean? You know,
For sure.
be yourself. Like, who is that self? Where do you even find it?
Right, exactly. And I think that's what makes this whole topic of authenticity so fascinating, so slippery.
Yeah, because there's all this philosophical weight behind it.
Totally. Centuries of debate and different perspectives. And that's what we're going to dive into today, this idea of authenticity. And for this deep dive, we're going straight to the source, like the ultimate guide,
Oh, nice.
the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy.
Okay, yeah, that's pretty comprehensive.
So think of this as your express lane through like hundreds of years of philosophical thought,
Okay, cool.
all about what it means to be authentic.
Yeah.
And we're going to try to make it as fun and as clear as possible. So you don't have to wade through all those dense academic texts yourself.
Right. It's like we're doing the hard work for you,
Exactly.
but we're going to make it like an actual conversation.
Yeah, for sure.
So our goal today isn't just to like hit you with a dictionary definition,
Right.
and then you just memorize it and move on.
No. This is much deeper than that.
It's about really exploring this concept of what it means to be truly you.
Right.
Because that phrase gets thrown around so much.
Yeah?
But what have philosophers throughout history, like, what have they had to say about it?
Yeah.
And more importantly, what might it mean for your own life? For you listening?
Right. That's the key.
Like, how does this impact your thoughts?
Exactly.
The decisions you make?
Mhm.
The things you feel responsible for?
Yeah. And the Stanford Encyclopedia entry like really dives into that. Like this is not just some airy-fairy abstract idea.
Right.
This bumps up against some pretty huge fundamental questions about what it means to be human, how we know ourselves, and even how we should live.
Yeah.
So it's getting into metaphysical questions, epistemological questions, and moral questions.
Okay, so there are a lot of big words in there.
But honestly, they're super relevant to this idea of authenticity.
Yeah.
Like, take this idea of being true to yourself.
Okay.
On one level, everything you do is undeniably you doing it.
Right. That makes sense.
It's just a fact. It's like you are the agent of your actions.
Yeah.
It's a metaphysical truth. But then there's this nagging sense that sometimes our actions, our thoughts, maybe even our feelings, they don't quite line up with who we really feel ourselves to be deep down.
Right. So it's almost like we're looking for an original source.
Oh, that's a great way to put it. Like, are we the undisputed origin of everything we do? Or are we trying to be faithful to some kind of original blueprint of ourselves?
Yeah, like some kind of ideal version of ourselves.
And that's when this conversation really gets interesting.
Right.
And it gets personal because it touches on our sense of identity.
Mhm.
Who are we really?
Mm.
And also our sense of responsibility.
Right.
Are we really accountable for actions that feel somehow alien to our true selves?
Right. And like how much of that is like, you just being lazy and not wanting to do the dishes.
Right, exactly. It gets messy.
All right.
And that's what makes it so fascinating.
Okay, so before we get too deep into that, let's like rewind a little bit.
Sure, yeah.
Like, where did this whole ideal of authenticity even come from? It wasn't always like the buzzword it is today.
Oh, definitely not. It had a history.
Yeah.
And the Stanford entry actually traces its rise to a specific period, to the 17th and 18th centuries.
Okay, interesting.
So think about the cultural scene back then. Like what was happening? There was this massive shift going on.
Okay.
This real focus on the individual.
Okay.
A move away from just seeing people in terms of their social roles or like their place in some kind of hierarchy.
So instead of like, oh, that's the blacksmith's, and it's like, oh, that's Bob, kind of.
Exactly. It's like the spotlight was shifting from the group to the individual.
Okay, got it.
And you can even see this reflected in some pretty concrete changes. Like, think about the rise of autobiographies during this period.
Okay.
Or self-portraits in art.
Right.
Suddenly, the individual life, the individual perspective, it became a subject worthy of attention in its own right. It wasn't just about, like, your family name or your profession anymore. It was about you.
Okay, so it's like society itself is being reconceptualized, like
Yeah.
less of a fixed thing and more about the individuals who make it up.
Exactly. And Taylor talks about this growing awareness of inwardness, like this internal world of thoughts and feelings that we all have.
Yeah.
And that gained increasing importance. This really created a key distinction between who we are in private and how we present ourselves publicly.
Right. And this new focus on the individual, I mean, it kind of changes how we evaluate ourselves and others, right?
For sure.
Like the article mentions a decline in the importance of sincerity and honor.
Yes, exactly. In earlier periods, a sincere person was someone who, honestly tried to fulfill the duties of their social role.
Okay.
They were playing their part well.
Yeah.
But by the time we get to Hegel, this ideal of sincerity starts to feel a bit lacking.
Okay.
He even dismisses it. He calls it, the heroism of dumb service.
Ouch. Okay, so what did Hegel want instead?
He wanted people to go beyond just blindly following social expectations.
Oh, okay.
It wasn't enough to just be truthful within that system.
So just playing your assigned role wasn't enough anymore.
That's exactly the shift that happens. It was about being true to yourself for your own sake.
Okay, so we're seeing this growing emphasis on the individual and this idea of being true to yourself.
Right.
How does this connect to the concept of autonomy?
Oh, that's a super important link.
Okay.
Because the ethic of authenticity builds on the idea of autonomy. It takes it a step further.
Okay.
Autonomy stresses our ability to direct ourselves, to make choices based on our own reasons and reflections.
So like self-governance.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay.
So both authenticity and autonomy agree that we should try to live according to our own principles, ones that we've chosen for ourselves.
Okay.
The common thread is this ability to think about our actions and make sure they're aligned with our goals.
Okay, but there's a distinction too, right?
Absolutely.
Because authenticity seems to go deeper than just being rational.
Yes, you're getting at the nuance here.
Okay, good.
So authenticity brings in this idea that there are these deep-seated motives and desires that might be more important than just pure logic sometimes.
Okay, so it's not just about what my brain tells me is right.
No, it's also about what rings true for you on a deeper level.
Okay, yeah, that makes sense.
And Taylor adds to this. He suggests that we should only really follow those moral principles that come from outside if they also resonate within us.
Okay, so they have to match up with what we feel is important personally.
Yes. Authenticity has this element of personal resonance. You could, in theory, be super autonomous, rationally choosing all your principles, but still feel like you're living a lie if those principles don't actually reflect who you are.
Okay, that's a really interesting distinction.
It is. And there's even more to it.
Yeah.
Some philosophers, Oshana, for example, argue that authenticity might require more than just autonomy.
Oh, wow, okay.
You could be making all your own choices, but if you're ignoring core parts of who you are, you're still not really being authentic.
Okay, so it's like this idea of the true self really starts to become central here.
Yeah, it does. And to understand that idea better, we need to look at where this modern notion of the self came from.
Okay, yeah.
And the Stanford entry highlights a really key figure in this whole development.
Who's that?
Jean-Jacques Rousseau.
Oh, yeah.
So he was a big deal back in the 18th century.
Okay.
And he really pushed this idea that we should be guided by our inner feelings and our conscience.
Okay.
That's where the true guidance for our lives should come from.
Okay, interesting. So this focus on the inner world.
Yeah, exactly. This whole idea of inwardness. And you see it really explored in his autobiography, Confessions.
Right.
Which, by the way, was pretty groundbreaking for its time.
Okay.
Because he was, really honest about his personal experiences and feelings.
Okay.
So once this inner world becomes the ultimate authority, then we face this new challenge.
Okay. What's that?
Figuring out which of our inner impulses and desires are genuine and which are maybe superficial or distractions.
Right. So it's not like everything we feel is automatically our true self.
Exactly. We have to learn to listen to our inner voice, really carefully.
Yeah.
To tell the difference between what's authentic and what's just noise.
It's like we have to become archaeologists of our own inner world.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it. Sifting to the layers to find the real treasures.
Right. And this idea has parallels in other areas too, right?
Yeah, definitely. The Stanford entry connects this to what they call religious individualism.
Okay. Interesting.
So this was a trend where religious life became more focused on the individual's direct experience of the divine, less about rituals and dogma,
Okay.
more about your personal connection.
Yeah.
And it also emphasized introspection, examining your own motives and conscience.
Okay.
Foucault even argues that we've come to believe that the deepest truth about ourselves is hidden inside us,
Okay.
and we just need to find a way to access it.
Yeah.
He sees confession in all its different forms as connected to this idea.
Okay, that's fascinating.
So we've created this distinction between what we believe is true and false within ourselves.
Right.
And this leads to this belief that we can not only understand our inner states, but also change them.
Right. So it's not just about self-knowledge, but also about self-improvement.
Yeah.
Okay. So Rousseau was really influential in shaping this modern idea of the self.
Right. But he also had some warnings about this inward focus, didn't he?
Yeah, he did. It wasn't all sunshine and roses.
Right. Like he argued that going against those essential parts of ourselves is a form of self-betrayal.
Okay.
Like almost a kind of self-annihilation.
Wow. Okay.
You can see this really clearly in his novel, The New Heloise,
Okay.
which, by the way, was a huge bestseller back in the day.
Right.
So the novel really shows the personal cost of suppressing those deepest motivations.
Okay. So it's like a cautionary tale about what happens when you don't live authentically.
Yeah, exactly. And in another work, his Discourse on the Origin of Inequality, he expresses this worry about the public sphere.
Okay.
He's concerned that it actually undermines our ability to connect with our true selves.
Okay. So it's like society, in a way, is making it harder to be authentic.
Yeah, in a sense, because there's all this pressure to play different roles to conform to expectations.
Right. All that social maneuvering.
Yeah, and that erodes our moral compass, he argues.
Okay. So the very thing that's telling us to be ourselves is also making it harder to figure out who that self is.
Right. That's the paradox.
Okay, so this tension kind of sets the stage for the critiques of authenticity that would come later.
Yeah, like focus on our feelings and desires, raise some red flags for some people.
Okay. What were some of the main concerns?
Well, one big worry was that this intense focus on inner feelings could lead to self-centeredness.
Okay, yeah, I can see that.
Like a narcissistic focus on yourself
Yeah.
that could actually harm your relationships with others.
Yeah, like if you're only concerned with your own authenticity, you might end up being a jerk to everyone else.
Right. And some thinkers, like Christopher Lasch, even connected this to narcissistic personality disorder.
Oh, wow, okay.
He saw some similarities in the traits, like a lack of empathy and this really self-absorbed worldview.
Okay.
Another critic, Alan Bloom, worried that this culture of authenticity was making people's minds narrower,
Okay.
like less concerned with the bigger picture,
Okay.
less interested in things beyond their own personal experience.
Okay.
And Daniel Bell even brought up the economic implications.
Oh, okay.
He was concerned that this intense focus on self-fulfillment could actually undermine the traditional values of hard work and discipline.
Okay, so he's worried about the impact on, like, the economy as a whole.
Yeah, exactly. And then there's the philosophical critique of authenticity.
Okay.
Some philosophers argued that the whole concept is based on this shaky idea of a true self.
Okay, yeah, that makes sense.
It's like, do we really have this fixed essence that we need to be true to?
Right.
Or is the self more fluid and constantly changing?
Yeah, and Feldman even suggests that we might be better off ditching the whole concept of authenticity.
Really?
Yeah, because he thinks it's built on these, like, questionable assumptions about the nature of the self.
Okay, so there's a lot of skepticism about whether this true self even exists.
Yeah, definitely.
But the article also mentions a counter-argument to all this worry about self-absorption.
Yeah, for sure.
Like some argue that authenticity can actually lead to greater social engagement.
Right, because it all depends on what you think you'll find when you look inward.
If you believe, like Rousseau did, that human nature is fundamentally good,
Yeah.
then turning inward, discovering your true self, should actually make you a better person.
Okay, that makes sense.
More compassionate, more connected to others.
Right, because you're getting in touch with that innate goodness.
Exactly. And Taylor talks about this too, this idea of an inward and upward trajectory.
Okay.
So as you delve deeper into yourself, you're also moving towards a deeper connection with the social world.
Okay, so it's not just about you. It's about, like, expanding outwards.
Right. It's about finding that balance.
Okay, but that's assuming that we find something good when we look inside, right?
Right. And that's where the critiques from people like Nietzsche and Freud come in.
Okay, yeah. They had some pretty different ideas about the unconscious.
Yeah, they were like, hold on a second. Let's not romanticize this inner world too much.
Right.
Because there might be some, like, darker forces at play.
Yeah, like some not so pretty stuff lurking down there.
Exactly. And if our inner lives aren't necessarily a reliable guide to what's good and right,
Yeah.
then building a whole ethical framework around being true to those impulses can be pretty problematic.
Right. So it's not as simple as just following your gut.
Yeah, definitely not. And then you have another layer of critique, too.
Okay, what's that?
This one questions the whole idea of a separation between the individual and society.
Okay.
Like, is it even accurate to think of ourselves as these isolated individuals who are separate from our social environment?
Right, because we're constantly interacting with other people.
Exactly. And critics like Slater and Bella argue that our communities actually shape who we are.
Okay, so it's not like we have this pre-existing self that we bring into society.
Right. We're formed by our interactions with others.
Yeah.
Adorno even critiques the idea that we can just choose our identity in a vacuum.
Okay.
He emphasizes how much we're shaped by others, often in unconscious ways.
Right, so there's this whole social dimension to who we are.
Yeah, exactly. And Foucault takes it even further.
Okay, he always does.
Right. He suggests that the very idea of a stable self is historically contingent.
Okay, so it's not something that's fixed and unchanging.
Exactly. It's something that's been constructed over time.
Okay, so this idea of an original self is starting to look pretty shaky.
Yeah, it is. And Rorty adds to this by questioning whether there even is a pre-existing truth about ourselves.
Okay, so it's not like there's this answer out there waiting to be discovered.
Right. It's more like we're constantly creating and recreating ourselves through our experiences.
Okay, so all of this really complicates this idea of being true to yourself.
Yeah, because if we're constantly changing, who is that self we're supposed to be true to?
Right, like what's the benchmark?
Exactly. And that leads to some pretty heady philosophical debates.
Okay, well, speaking of philosophical debates, the Stanford entry goes on to explore some specific interpretations of authenticity,
Yes.
starting with Kierkegaard.
Right. So he's considered the father of existentialism.
Okay.
And his ideas were super influential.
Yep.
So for Kierkegaard, authenticity was about this process of becoming what one is,
Okay.
which sounds a bit paradoxical,
Yeah.
but it's about recognizing that you're not a finished product.
Okay.
You're constantly evolving.
Okay.
And for him, this was tied to this critique of society.
Okay.
He saw this tendency towards conformity, towards what he called leveling down,
Okay.
where everyone was just kind of blending in, losing their individuality.
Right, so like just following the crowd.
Yeah, exactly. And he thought this led to a kind of despair,
Okay.
this sense of emptiness and meaninglessness.
Okay, so he's saying that we need to embrace our individuality.
Yeah, and not just in some superficial way.
Okay.
Like, it's not just about wearing different clothes.
Right.
It's about really engaging with the world in a way that's true to who you are.
Okay.
And he famously said, the self is a relation that relates itself to itself.
Okay, that's a mouthful.
Yeah. But what he means is that the self isn't a static thing.
Oh.
It's constantly being shaped by our relationships and our choices.
Okay, so it's about the process of becoming.
Exactly. And for Kierkegaard, authenticity wasn't about solitary introspection.
Okay.
It was about passionately committing to something outside yourself.
Okay, so it's about finding something bigger than yourself to believe in.
Yeah, for him it was God,
Okay.
but it could be any number of things, really.
Right, like a cause or a community.
Exactly. And that commitment is what gives your life meaning and direction.
Okay, so it's about action.
Yeah.
It's about engaging with the world.
Exactly. And then we have Heidegger, who takes a different but equally fascinating approach.
Okay, tell me about Heidegger.
So he's another existentialist philosopher.
Okay.
And his concept of Eigentlichkeit is often translated as authenticity.
Okay.
But it literally means ownedness.
Ownedness.
Yeah, like taking ownership of who you are.
Okay, I kind of like that.
Yeah, it's a powerful image. And he saw human beings, or Daliner as he called it, as this kind of being that's always in question.
Yep.
Like our very existence is a problem for us to solve.
Okay, that sounds stressful.
It can be,
Yeah.
but it's also what makes us unique.
Okay.
Because we have this ability to reflect on who we are and to make choices about who we want to become.
Okay.
And our understanding of ourselves is always shaped by our social context.
Right, because we're not just isolated individuals.
Exactly. And Heidegger uses this term, the they, to describe this shared social world.
Okay, so it's like all the unspoken rules and expectations that shape how we think and act.
Yeah, exactly. Like all those things we just take for granted.
Okay.
And he says that we can get lost in the they.
Okay.
We can start to just go along with the crowd without really thinking for ourselves.
Right, so like becoming a sheep.
Yeah, and he calls this falling.
Falling.
Yeah, it's this state of distraction and forgetfulness
Okay.
where we lose touch with who we really are.
Okay, so how do we avoid falling?
Well, Heidegger says that there are certain experiences that can shake us out of this complacency.
Okay.
Things like anxiety.
Oh, fun.
Right. But anxiety can actually be a good thing, according to Heidegger,
Okay, how so?
because it forces us to confront our own individuality.
Oh,
Like suddenly the world doesn't feel so safe and familiar anymore,
yeah.
and we have to face ourselves as we really are.
Okay. So it's like a wake-up call.
Yeah, exactly. And then there's the inevitability of death.
Okay. Even more fun.
Right. But again, Heidegger says that this awareness of our own mortality can actually be liberating
Okay. How so?
because it forces us to focus on what really matters.
Okay.
Like, what do we want to do with our limited time here?
Okay. So it's about living intentionally.
Yeah. And then there's the call of conscience,
Okay.
which for Heidegger isn't like a voice telling you what's right and wrong.
Yeah.
It's more like this feeling of indebtedness to our own potential.
Okay.
Like, we have a responsibility to live up to who we could be.
Okay. That's interesting.
Yeah, and all of these experiences can lead us to what he calls care.
Care.
Yeah, it's like the fundamental structure of our being in the world.
Okay.
It's what allows us to engage with the world in a meaningful way.
Okay.
And from care, we can develop resoluteness.
Resoluteness.
Yeah, it's this steadfast commitment to our authentic selves.
Okay. So it's about making a decision to live authentically.
Yeah, and sticking to it.
Even when it's hard.
Exactly. And for Heidegger, this isn't about feelings.
Okay.
It's about taking responsibility for our choices,
Okay.
for the values and goals that give our lives meaning.
Okay. So it's a very different kind of authenticity from what we often hear about today.
Yeah, it's much more existential,
Right.
more about facing up to the fundamental questions of existence.
Okay. And then we have Sartre and de Beauvoir, who bring in their own unique perspective on authenticity.
Right, so they're both existentialists as well.
Okay.
But they emphasize the importance of freedom and responsibility. So Sartre, in his big book, Being and Nothingness, he launches this attack on what he calls the spirit of seriousness.
Okay. What's that?
It's this belief that there are objective values out there that tell us what's right and wrong, what's good and bad.
Okay. Like a universal moral code.
Yeah, and Sartre rejects that.
Okay.
He says that we create our own values,
Okay.
that there's no pre-existing meaning in the universe.
Okay. So we're kind of on our own here.
Yeah, in a sense.
Okay.
And he focuses on this tension between what he calls facticity and transcendence.
Okay. Those are big words.
Yeah, so facticity is like all the givens of our existence,
Okay.
like our past, our bodies, the circumstances we were born into.
Okay. So like the things we can't change.
Yeah, exactly. And then transcendence is our ability to go beyond those givens,
Okay.
to imagine possibilities, to make choices.
Okay. So it's like our freedom.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
And for Sartre, this freedom is both exhilarating and terrifying
Oh, okay. I can see that.
because it means that we're responsible for our own lives.
Yeah. Right. There's no one else to blame.
Yeah.
Okay. And this is where his concept of bad faith comes in, right?
Yes.
Because he's saying that we often try to avoid this freedom.
Right. Because it's a lot of pressure.
Yeah.
And bad faith is basically self-deception.
Okay.
It's pretending that we don't have a choice when we really do.
Okay. So it's like lying to ourselves about who we are.
Yeah, and Sartre doesn't really talk about authenticity directly in Being and Nothingness,
Okay.
but he does hint at it.
Okay.
He says that authenticity is a kind of self-recovery,
Okay.
like reclaiming our freedom from the illusions of bad faith.
Okay. So it's about becoming aware of our own self-deception.
Yeah, and taking responsibility for our choices.
Okay.
And later, in his book, Anti-Semite and Jew, he talks about authenticity more explicitly.
Okay.
He says it's about having a clear consciousness of your situation
Okay.
and assuming responsibility for your actions.
Okay. So it's about being honest with yourself.
Yeah, and then we have de Beauvoir, who really builds on these ideas in her book, The Ethics of Ambiguity.
Okay. So she's adding her own perspective.
Right, she's taking Sartre's ideas and developing them in her own way.
Okay.
And she really emphasizes the connection between individual freedom and ethical responsibility.
Okay.
She says that if you truly embrace your own freedom, you have to will the freedom of others as well.
Okay. So my freedom is tied to the freedom of everyone else.
Exactly.
Okay.
And she also talks about the importance of engagement.
Engagement.
Yeah, it's about being actively involved in the world,
Okay.
not just withdrawing into yourself.
Okay.
And she says that the authentic individual is one who embraces this freedom and acts with clarity and commitment.
Okay. So it's about making choices and taking action.
Yeah. And she says that acting against your deepest commitments, living inauthentically, it actually transforms who you are.
Okay. So it's not just a matter of like feeling bad about yourself.
Right. It actually changes your being in the world.
Okay. So we've covered a lot of ground here with these existentialist thinkers.
Yeah, we have.
And now I want to move on to some more recent attempts to like revisit and maybe even rescue this idea of authenticity.
Right, because it's been through the ringer a bit.
Yeah.
But there are a lot of philosophers who still think it's a valuable concept.
Okay.
And they're trying to find ways to address those earlier critiques.
Okay, so like refining it and making it more relevant to today's world.
Yeah, exactly. And the Stanford entry mentions a few key figures in this.